Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. Today's video is one that I've been looking forward to for the last few weeks, if not longer. It's my top 10 favourite books of 2023. So with this one, I'm not going to do a big long preamble building into it. There are no honourable mentions. It's quite simply a case of my top 10 favourite books that I've read in 2023. The only caveat to that is it's following my normal kind of top 10 rule of one book per series only. So there may possibly be multiple books by the same author if they are in different series, but I cannot count two different books from the same series. With this one as well, it is just based on kind of a gut feeling. It's not necessarily the book that scored, or the 10 books that scored the highest on my weighted ratings. It's more than that. It's how I feel about the books after having read them some time ago in some cases, how much they've stayed with me, how much I've thought about them after I put the books down. Some of these are more recent, so there is, yes, perhaps a bit of recency bias in there, but that's unavoidable. With all that said though, let's dive into my top 10 favourite books that I read in 2023. Sitting in number 10, I'm going to go with No Safe Haven by James Lloyd Doolan. I really had a great time with this one, and it's a little bit unusual because I haven't actually tracked this one or marked this one on Goodreads or Storylace, because I didn't read it for pleasure. I proofread this one. It is a different reading experience when you're reading for pleasure as against reading for business, essentially, when I'm proofreading it. But I still had a really good time as I was working my way through this one, and I think that's the sign of a really good book. I loved the progression of the story, both going forwards and backwards, because you get kind of a dual storyline in this one where you're seeing the backstory play out in some chapters and the present day, if you like, story playing out in other chapters. I really enjoyed both of those. I enjoyed the characters. You get additional characters coming into this one, not only as we meet new people, but as we get an expansion of what we know of a couple of characters we met in the first book. But I did have a really great time in the second book of Malatu. The magic, I think, is really interesting in this one. I love seeing all the depictions of it kind of playing out as they're going through the storyline of the book, basically. So number 10 in my list is No Safe Haven, Book 2 of Malatu by James Lloyd Doolan. Coming in at 9th in my list, this is a bit of a weird one because when I finished it, I was all over it. I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed my time reading it. And it's book 2 in Emaneska by Bengali. This one is Pale Kings. Now, the reason I say it's a little bit weird is because I've soured on the series because book 3 and 4 I didn't enjoy as much, and I think that has probably kind of tainted my impression, my overall kind of feeling about this second book. But I definitely remember having such a great time with it. There were some incredible battles and some really intense scenes in this book, and I really loved exploring more about the world, the creatures. There are quite a few of them in here, kind of mythical and almost paranormal, I guess, creatures that you're introduced to in this series as a whole. I loved the character, I loved the magic that you got in here. But yes, as I say, overall, I think my impression of Pale Kings is slightly soured by what came afterwards, basically with Dead Stars Part 1 and 2, which I just didn't enjoy as much. So perhaps if it wasn't for that, Pale Kings would finish higher up in this list, but as it is, it's coming in at number 9. In at 8th, and I've got one of my most recent reads actually. This is Those Who Resist, Book 3 in the Waystations trilogy, a sci-fi trilogy by N.C. Scrimgeour. Now, this one, very much in the same vein as Pale Kings, had some really intense scenes, and I absolutely loved them. Being a third book in a trilogy and one which is action-packed, you know you're going to get a lot of action in here. And pretty much from right at the start of the book to the end of the book, it just did not let up. The pacing was really nicely done here, though. I didn't feel like it was rushing all the way through at 100 miles an hour. It did slow down at various points when it needed to, and of course you do need that breather sometimes. But with a book like this, I appreciate a faster pace for the majority of it, and that's what I got here. I loved the characters, I loved the storylines, and It's the third book in a series. It's an epic space opera. You know there's going to be some things going wrong, but I love the way that they kind of countered those. The characters thought about ways to get around them. They made sacrifices, and it all came together really, really well for me. There were some great moments in here, some heartfelt scenes, and I absolutely loved it. And of course, I do like the books in a series that I'm enjoying kind of more as you work through them as a general rule. That definitely happened here. Book 2 in the series was also really good, Those Once Forgotten, but Those Who Resist just takes it for me because it was that final book in the series with everything coming together and such a fantastic story as you're working through all of the ins and outs of what's going on in this series and bringing all the threads to a close. In 7th, I've got, going from the end of the year to the start of the year, one of the earliest books I read in 2023 was Age You All Sin, Book 2 in the Eelborn Saga by Daniel T. Jackson. Now again, this is another one that I came out of it on a real high. I really loved the intensity that you got through here. I read the second half of the book, bearing in mind that it's something like 700 pages. The second half just absolutely flew by for me because it was written at such a high pace. So I was just flying through, metaphorically tearing the pages as I was going. I loved again the intensity and the continuation of what you got in Eelborn, but it was all dialed up an extra couple of notches. The characters here, a lot of people have some issues with one or two of the characters. I actually like all four of our main characters, but what I did like here is that you do have a fifth main character. It's not actually a point of view character, so to speak, but you do get a fifth character who we know from the first book, but plays a bigger part in this second book. And I think it made all the difference because it helped with learning some of the history and what's gone on outside of the scope of the individual characters you're seeing this story from the point of view of. I'm really looking forward to the third book in the series, and I hope that it continues in the same vein because this was really exciting thrill ride for me and I loved every minute of it. Coming in at number 6 is one that's a little bit different for me. I wasn't sure what to expect from it, but what I got was a fantastic story. This is Sea of Souls, book 1 of the Sea of Souls saga by N.C. Scrimgeour. So well done, N.C. Scrimgeour. 2 books on the list from 2 different series this year. I loved what you got here. It's a Scottish inspired or Scottish folklore inspired fantasy full of Selkies and Kelpies and wraiths, and I loved how it all pulled together and gave you something very different. But as much as a fantasy can be, it was very believable. Nothing felt out of place, nothing felt forced. It was all just very, very well written. I loved the characters and their interactions here, and the overall story was something just, for me, really refreshing and exciting. I can't wait to dive back into this series because I had such a good time with it. And as you can tell, with me having another book by this author on my list here, I'm really enjoying her writing. So yeah, I can't wait to experience more of it. Book 5 in my top 10 is Until the Last by Mike Shackle. This is the third and final book in The Last War, a series that I've had such a great time with. I'm not sure whether I enjoyed the second book a little bit more, Fool's Hope, over this one, Until the Last, but I read that last year so it doesn't qualify for this list. Either way, both books were really great. I love the overall story that you got here. I am a bit of a sucker for a nice tale of rebellion and uprising against the oppressors, and that's what you get throughout this whole series. The first book, We Are the Dead, was really refreshing for me at the time, and it just carried on through the second and the third book. There were a few elements I didn't like quite as much in this, in the second and the third book, but I think the way that they were written and the way that they tied into the rest of the story, it really helped because you had some elements that could have really turned the tide in such a ridiculous way, overpowered characters that basically would have been unbeatable. But it wasn't like that. The way it was written into the story and incorporated into the actual overall plot, I thought really toned down those powers and made it so it was more about the people and pretty much about the other people around these characters that made the difference. I love the way that worked. I loved the overall character work as a whole, and the series itself was another one of these ones that was written at a really great pace, really building from the start of the first book to the end of the third book. I love that kind of trajectory that a series can have if it's done well, and this one for me was done very well. Number 4 on my list is the first book in the Talon duology by Jen Williams. This is Talon's Sister. Now, I've seen a few people who haven't liked this one as much, but I absolutely loved the world building that you got here. It's a bit like Sea of Souls in that you've got kind of old folklore kind of references for a lot of it. You've got druids, you've got griffins, you've got talk of god boar and giant bears and all of these other things that are called titans, and basically the bones of these titans are grafted into the skin of people to make them kind of super soldiers. But there's a problem with these super soldiers, and they've only got a short shelf life, and it leads to a really interesting story. I liked the element where you've got a lot of griffins. You've got griffins as your main characters, and they interact with humans because one family of griffins has kind of adopted a young human and raised her as their own. So it's a really interesting dynamic, but I like the way that they interact with other characters in the world as well. The story is told pretty much from 3 points of view, and I liked the individual storyline that you got with all 3 of those, but I loved more than that the revelations you got at the end of the story as these all started to pull together. I'm really excited to see where that takes us now that these things are out in the open and some of our storylines are really converging, and I can't wait to read the second book in this duology. Into my top 3 then, and number 3 is another one that's a little bit weird because it's another book that I proofread. Not only that though, a lot of people, myself included, would never have thought this would be one of my top books of the year. It's However Many Must Die, book 1 of the Blood Scouts by Phil Williams. I absolutely loved this one. It's a lot to say that I was blown away, but I think for this book I was blown away purely because of where my expectations were of the kind of subgenre, I suppose, against where I actually ended up with it. I was so invested in these characters. As I was reading through it, I was actually there with them. It felt like I was seeing through their eyes. It was so well written, but the characters themselves I was so at home with. I loved the kind of interactions that you got. It's a wartime setting. It's kind of a behind enemy lines storyline, and the banter that you got with these characters I just thought was really good. I love it when you get that and it's done well, and it was done very well here. I loved the overall storyline. There was some really cool magic and limitations of magic. I just thought everything was really well pulled together. Again, it's one that I can't wait to read more of because I had such a good time, but it was probably heightened by my surprise at just how much I enjoyed this one. If you know me, you know that I'm not a fan of technology and guns in a fantasy novel. You got that here. You had guns. It was kind of like a Second World War kind of setting or technology level, but it just worked really well because this is a character-driven story. You're in the heart of the action with these characters. As I say, you're behind enemy lines. It's kind of down and dirty. People are dying all around because this is war. This is dark and gritty, but it was just really, really well done, and it's got so much heart in there. So yeah, if you haven't tried out However Many Must Die, I definitely recommend you do so. In at number 2 on my list, it's a title from one of my favourite authors of recent years. It's The Shadowgate, book 2 of Dragon Spirits by L.L. McRae. Now, I've spoken about this series a little bit in recent videos. It was recently number 1 in my current ongoing series, the unfinished series, where the author is still writing the books for them. I love the dragons that you get in here. I've always been one of these fantasy readers who loves a good dragon. And in here, L.L. McRae kind of reinvents them. And I think you need that to stop them from getting old, kind of figuratively speaking, not literally, because dragons often are very old creatures. But I love the twist on the tale that you get in here, but there's so much more to these stories as well. The characters and the character interactions really do make it, but I love the overall world building and exploring more. Again, there's some really great revelations that you get in this book, especially towards the end, because that's how they generally tend to work in fiction, and I really can't wait to see how they play out in the next book in the series. The Dragon Spirits has so much to go for it. I've loved every book that I've read in it so far, from the first book, The Iron Crown, but also the novella, The Citrine Key. It's just been a really great ride, and I'm excited to continue on my journey with it. So then we come to number 1, my favourite absolute top book of 2023, And this one I'm going to give to The Godbreaker, Book 3 of The God King Chronicles by Mike Brooks. This is another series that I've absolutely loved. It was so refreshing and I really enjoyed every page as I was reading them. These are some chunky books. The 3 books that make up the trilogy are all in the 500 to 700 page range, but they did fly by for me because I was enjoying them so much. There's a really good narration. I did audio for these 3 books and I really enjoyed it. It's a very kind of different world in some of the quirks that you get there, but I love how the author was both brave enough to try it and good enough to pull it off. And I think the audio maybe really helped with that, because it can potentially be slightly jarring reading these things on the page as opposed to having someone read them to you. The language that's used is a little bit strange at times, but I quickly got used to it. And I think that is the one kind of downside to this series in terms of new readers coming into it. I've seen some people who bounce off it because they don't kind of gel with the writing style in that sense. So this is to do with the pronouns that the characters use, or that certain of the characters use. They don't use I, they will refer to themselves kind of in the third person. So they'll say, this man saw so and so earlier on, or this lord thought this. And it doesn't take too much to get your head around it, but once you do, it opens up this entire world of the series, and I absolutely loved it. The overall kind of premise of the book I thought was really good. So from the first book in the series, you've got this raiding party. They've had a long running history with another nation who they keep raiding, and one day their ships turn up, but they're not there to raid. They want to settle down, they want to form a partnership essentially and live in peace alongside their old enemy. And I love the kind of dynamic that you get there, because it is so different as you've got these two different cultures coming together. There's obviously a lot of distrust on both sides, and they're trying to learn to live together, trying to learn each other's ways and trying to stay on the right side of each other. And then of course, as you move on into the second book, you've got the quest for acceptance across the wider nation as well. So I really enjoyed the first book. The second and third book that I read this year, that's The Splinter King and then The Godbreaker, were both 5-star reads for me. I had such a great time with them. The writing was just so fluid, it was so easy to listen to. The narration was obviously really good as well for the audiobook, and that definitely helped. But the overall story is one of the best that I have read or listened to in a number of years. I just love how everything pulled together. It was so exciting. You're never quite sure who's going to make it to the end of a story, because the author's not afraid to kill off a character if that's right for the story, and I really do appreciate that. But overall, it was just such an exciting series, one that I'm so happy I finally got round to, and one that I absolutely recommend for any fan of epic fantasy. So there's my top 10, my favourite 10 books that I read in 2023. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this. Were there any surprises on here for you? And also, what were your top books of the year as well? I'll hopefully catch you in the next video sometime soon. Until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.